I hope everyone has enjoyed their meals and the conversation that took place over dinner. So let us all thank the Connexus Arts Center staff for a wonderful meal. Please, let's give them a round of applause. As you may know, some of our past guest speakers include Chantal Hebert, National Affairs columnist, The Toronto Star; John Manley, President and CEO, Canadian Council of Chief Executives, and former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada; as well as Peter Smith, Professor of Health Policy, Imperial College London. We are pleased to add Mr. David Herle to this list. Tonight, Mr. Herle will be speaking on the topic of public policy and the art of persuasion, which is very timely after the recent Saskatchewan provincial election. I would like to now welcome Samantha Bennis again to provide some background information on the Tansley lecture and to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
I'm right here. Thanks, Moses. And as the Honourable Minister said before, he gave some introduction remarks about Tansley, so we shortened a bit because we're tight on time. So the Tansley lecture is named after Donald Tansley, an individual whose career and character were both remarkable. Hired right out of the University of Saskatchewan by Al Johnson, Tansley began his career in the province's famed Budget Bureau, the same place that trained a whole generation of some of the most prominent civil servants in the country. As a public servant, Tansley gained a reputation for tackling some of the most intractable and painful jobs in the public sector for both the federal and provincial governments. His character shone through wherever the challenge. He motivated and led individuals by emphasizing the positive and the constructive. When he worked with Al Johnson, who could be extremely tough on his staff because of his high standards, it was Don Tansley who came in to clean it up. He encouraged these discouraged individuals not to give up, to find the strength to finish the job, and to take such harsh judgments with a grain of salt. That being said, I'd like to take a few moments to introduce our keynote speaker of the night, Mr. David Hurley. David Hurley is one of Canada's most sought-after public affairs and corporate strategists. He has helped CEOs manage crises, union leaders shape their public appeals, and directed winning campaigns for both prime ministers and premiers. With more than 20 years' experience in research and communication analysis, David has built a reputation as a source of smart, strategic, and strong counsel. His strategic and political acumen can be seen on CBC's The National, where he provides bi-weekly commentary on the Insiders panel. David's political experience includes working on 9 consecutive government budgets, most notably the landmark 1995 budget that paved the way for eliminating the federal deficit. That budget turned conventional political wisdom on its head by making a bad news budget a huge political success. David was Premier Kathleen Wynne's campaign co-chair, steering the Ontario Liberals to a majority government in 2014. As national campaign chair for the Liberal Party, he also helped engineer former Prime Minister Martin his electoral victory in 2004. In 2016, David was also awarded the Reed Award from Campaigns and Elections for the best international political advertising campaign for his work on the Justin Trudeau campaign, which hopefully we'll hear a little bit about tonight. He is frequently a speaker and lecturer at universities and conferences on such topics such as politics, economic policy, consumer and branding issues, energy, healthcare, crisis management, agriculture, and the environment. A Saskatchewan native, David earned his Bachelor of Arts at the University of Regina and was called to the bar in Ontario after receiving his LLB from the University of Saskatchewan. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Hurley.
So I don't know whether it's more intimidating to be speaking in front of a bunch of friends or a bunch of academics, but either way, I'm feeling a little bit more daunted than I normally do in a circumstance like this. Thank you, Moses, and thank you, Samantha. For this, I'd like to thank the University of Regina, and particularly the Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy, for the invitation to make this address. As a graduate of this university, it's enormously flattering to me and almost certainly appalling to my former professors to be back here in this capacity. I'm sure that they never imagined that I would be speaking at something like this. I did grow up a lot while attending this institution. I almost certainly spent too much time engaged in heated debates in the lab cafeteria or the Lazy Owl. But it was a great period of my life. I recall with great fondness the mentoring of people like Sammy McCarthy from Campion College, who really taught me a lot about life and about how to be a university student. Or Howard Leeson, who was fresh off being a central figure in the national constitutional debate, who would indulge the modestly informed passions of a young partisan of a different stripe and keep me. Or even the geology prof, whose name I forget, who gave me a failing grade. It was the only one I ever got in school, and it was a much-needed wake-up call, and of course a good practice for many crushing failures to come in my future. I was not the most distinguished student of this institution. Nobody offered to name me the most outstanding graduate of the University of Regina, and that's wrong because I'm quite clever. But I blame Ralph. I blame Ralph for this because given the choice between learning about politics by sitting in the back of a lecture hall with 175 people in it, listening to somebody talk about academic politics, or driving across Saskatchewan in the front seat of the car with Ralph learning about politics, it was absolutely no question. I don't regret it for a second, despite the WFs on my transcript. Those drives with Ralph became the foundation of my career, and I'm enormously grateful for the time he spent with me. I didn't have the privilege to know Donald Tansley, unlike Harold McKay, who apparently is older than him. But I can be proud of him nonetheless. Along with the namesakes of this graduate school, he was a Saskatchewanian who helped this province punch above its weight in national policy making. The breadth and diversity of his accomplishments is breathtaking, from reinventing the Red Cross internationally to reinventing the governance of New Brunswick. And between the creations of Medicare here in Saskatchewan to the National Administration of Wage and Price Controls, he was a central figure in the great debates of this country for decades. There could not be a better role model for aspiring public servants. I've been asked to talk about the intersection between public opinion and public policy, the ways in which public opinion drives public policy, but also how, occasionally, governments can, through the art of persuasion, change public opinion. Public opinion is obviously a significant input into governmental decision-making, and the idea that it's influential in government decisions is almost universally derided as a negative. It's said to be the sign of an unprincipled government, like a weather vane reflecting the knee-jerk impulses of the masses. It's the antithesis of the strong leader who does what he or she knows to be right, no matter what the pressures from the public are. I can't agree with any of that. I actually find it to be anti-democratic. Let me go on a little rant here for a second. In our lifetime, I think nobody has done more to distort the reality between leaders and their citizens than Aaron Sorkin. Through his TV show, The West Wing, and in a major motion picture called The American President, he propagated the myth that all a real leader had to do was stand up and say the courageous truth, and the public will fall in behind them. Of course, this being Hollywood, the courageous truth was always the liberal truth. That's the first problem with the Sorkin Hollywood myth. It assumes that in every political question there is one truth. I don't want what I say about this to be confused with the circus going on in American politics, where there are actually no agreed-upon facts anymore. There are indisputable facts that must underlie public policy. But once you move into policy formation, you're out of the realm of facts and into things that are arguable, depending on one's perspective. That's where persuasion comes in. The second Sorkin problem is the notion that if you tell people what they want to hear, if you tell people what they don't want to hear, but ought to hear, you will be rewarded. Is that right, Ralph? Is that how it works? The fact is, you're far more likely to be punished for that. That may be the price of leadership, but let's at least acknowledge that reality. Joe Clark put a 4-cent a litre tax on the price of gas and lost power immediately. Mackenzie King, who dithered his way through 26 years of government, is on the $50 bill. That's the reality of politics. Leaders and governments survive by staying within the slipstream of public opinion. There are cases where governments do disregard dire warnings from pollsters about public opinion, and that tends to be on the core priorities of the government or the Prime Minister. When the Mulroney cabinet was approving the GST, David Crombie, a minister at that time, looked around the room at all the ministers. He said, "You know we're all going to lose our seats over this, right?" However, they proceeded. The government believed that Canadian business could not compete under free trade unless they replaced the manufacturer's sales tax with a value-added tax. So they did it, and they were indeed defeated in large measure because of that proposal. Pierre Trudeau ignored the pleas of his pollster, Martin Goldfarb, and his other advisors as he spent the last weeks of the losing 1979 election campaigning on the need to patriate the Constitution, an issue voters did not care about while in the throes of an economic downturn. But Mr. Trudeau cared about it, and he felt that if he was going down, he would take Ralph with him. No, he said he felt that if he was going down, he would go down talking about the things that mattered to him. And when I first talked politics with Paul Martin in the early 1980s, he spoke passionately about the need to improve the situation of First Nations people. I told him then, and I told him when he was Prime Minister, the sad truth of our country is that there are no votes to be gotten by helping First Nations people. In fact, in most cases, it's a vote loser. And yet, in the dying days of his government, he was hosting a First Ministers' Conference in Kelowna on a new deal for First Nations people to culminate the work that took up a substantial amount of his time as Prime Minister. And he campaigned passionately on it in the election that followed. $5 billion directed toward a different priority might have made a difference in that election, but he didn't care. One of the lessons of those anecdotes is that if you are going to do something that is really unpopular on a point of principle, you had better be prepared to be defeated and lose office over it. But there is one example of where a public policy that had been assumed for decades, it's very Marco Rubio of me to reach over like that, but there is one example of where a public policy that had been assumed for decades to be politically fatal was transformed by active persuasion into political success. This is the story of federal deficit elimination in the 1990s. Which takes us to 1994. The Liberal government was elected in 1993 on a platform of deficit management, not deficit elimination. The country was just starting to emerge from the deep recession of the early 1990s. The economy was the issue on people's minds, not the government deficit. To be clear, in 1993, the deficit was a mild irritant to most Canadians and was a symbol of government incompetence, but most did not see it as the root of our economic problems. The inability of the Progressive Conservatives to rein in spending was not the reason they were defeated, and the Liberals were not elected on a promise of austerity. The Liberals had campaigned on stimulating growth and creating jobs, but at that time, most people were not making a connection between deficit elimination and job creation. Even among the new Liberal government, there was no consensus that the deficit was the fundamental problem with the Canadian economy. However, once in office, a combination of the basic arithmetic of compound interest on a bloated debt, along with international uncertainty, convinced the government that it needed to go further than it had planned and further than it had campaigned on in reducing the deficit. At that time, the debt-to-GDP ratio, the size of the accumulated debt relative to the size of the country's economy, was 75%. 1/3 of every tax dollar the federal government collected went to pay the interest on that debt. The substance of a deficit elimination policy was reasonably well understood. The officials in the Department of Finance had, you won't be surprised, been thinking about this for a while. It was the politics of deficit elimination that was considered to be intractable. There was no appetite in the public for cuts to spending on social programs, especially health or education. There was even less willingness to accept tax increases. There really was no acceptance of the need for sacrifice in order to get government's books into balance. Yet all that would have to happen in order to eliminate the deficit. The Department of Finance had a unique set of people around at that time, tremendous collection of officials, and they had a genuine commitment to understanding public opinion and finding policy solutions that were both good public policy and well-supported public policy. This is unusual. Most often, communications and public opinion are the concern only of the minister's office. But in the critical years after 1994, people like David Dodge, Scott Clark, and indeed Dale Eisler of the Johnson-Shoyama School, and other officials of finance believed that they could only successfully eliminate the deficit, which they considered to be the most urgent and important public policy challenge of the day, if they had broad buy-in from the Canadian people. They had learned this through hard lessons in the power of democracy, especially from a colorful elderly woman named Solange Denis. For those who don't remember, Ms. Denis was a pensioner who confronted Prime Minister Mulroney on Parliament Hill about proposed changes to old age security, changes that were central to that government's efforts to get the deficit under some kind of control. She called him a liar, and then she uttered the memorable words, "So long, Charlie Brown." Not long after, the pension changes were dead, as Mulroney told his finance minister to withdraw them. So, in preparation for the Chrétien-Martin assault on the deficit, opinion research and discussion led to a set of principles and assumptions that would guide the initiative. Number one, deficit reduction or elimination had to be seen to be essential to the well-being of the citizen. It would not be supported because of lectures about personal responsibility, Protestant values, or because the business community called for it. People had to believe that their jobs or standards of living depended on it. Messaging from the government continually reinforced that broader goal throughout the entire exercise. Let me quote, "Those who would have Canadians believe that there is a contradiction between deficit reduction and job creation are simply wrong. Continued deficit reduction is essential if we are to get interest rates down, interest rates that stand in the way of the creation of jobs," said Minister Martin in his first economic update after the 1995 budget. The second guiding principle was that the electorate had to understand it would not be easy. It is convenient for people to think that government deficits can be eliminated by getting at waste and inefficiencies without any real pain to the average citizen. People needed to understand the magnitude of the problem and the magnitude of the actions that would be required. Third, the plan for deficit elimination had to be credible. Public cynicism and partisanship were such strong forces that the government needed to seek virtually unanimous consensus that its plan was credible. If people believed that the government would fail to eliminate the deficit, then they would reject the sacrifices that were asked of them in pursuit of that goal. By the time Martin was making his move, very few people thought deficit elimination was even possible. Number four, pain had to be spread fairly to impact on every element of society. If one group can point to another and say, "Why me and not them?" public support will collapse in jealousy and recrimination. It was particularly important to ensure that the privileged were seen to be negatively impacted by the deficit fight. However, given the belief that waste is rampant in all government, you must convince people that all of their less favored spending was cut to the bone before any spending that they do care about was cut. Number five, it had to be seen as a true collective effort. Paul Martin made great use of national symbols, such as Parliament and public consultation, to create the sense of national purpose. His rhetoric reinforced the idea that it was more than a policy, it was a national imperative. Normally, one drinks their water during the applause lines. Armed with those principles and assumptions, a year-long exercise in preconditioning the public began. This would be a strategy that would heavily employ symbols, ramped-up rhetoric, and dramatically impact the budget-making process going forward. It began with a new practice that has since become a Canadian Parliamentary Convention, the Fall Economic Update, which was presented to Parliament's Finance Committee. The Economic Update was, from its inception, more than simply a speech. First of all, holy cow, in 1994, revolutionary for its time, it employed PowerPoint. Imagine the shock and awe of actual visuals behind the minister as he spoke. The media ate it up, guaranteed big national news coverage. By the way, disregard the fact that I've jettisoned my own PowerPoint thing, forget about it. The update also sought to reinforce the government's positioning that was starting to take hold among the public. It was comprehensive enough to give anybody comfort that the Liberal government had a more active economic strategy than just eliminating the deficit, and it was strategic enough to make it clear that the entire plan hinged on successfully getting the fiscal situation under control. The Parliament's Finance Committee was chosen deliberately as the forum for the launch of the public offensive. It provided the appropriate gravitas for the message that needed to break through. More importantly, Martin, a big believer in the importance of Parliament, was moving control over pre-budget consultations from the Department of Finance to the parliamentarians who made up the Finance Committee. The committee was encouraged, strongly encouraged, to invite different interests to the same table and force them to engage in the trade-offs inherent in cutting government spending. I can't tell you how effective this was by putting healthcare advocates, anti-poverty activists, and business leaders into the same discussion. They encouraged stakeholders to moderate their demands and moderate their positions, or be prepared to defend them against opposition. Second, it forced them to confront the same difficult choices that the government ultimately would, encouraging them to be more sympathetic to the choices that government had to make. Throughout, Martin employed uncommonly forceful language. We will meet these targets come hell or high water. Placing a flag on the territory of deficit elimination on the government's behalf, he transformed it into the government's signature policy. As the final element of the strategy, the finance team sought to leverage the brand of the governing party. By moving to reduce government spending, to shrink the size of government, and to prioritize deficit reduction over new social spending, the Liberal Party was acting counterintuitively. Years of political branding had left Canadians with a belief that Liberals were less interested in the business agenda and more interested in social spending than the Conservatives. This branding helped in two critical ways. First, it helped to convince the public that reducing the deficit was important, because people thought the Liberals were much less likely to be doing it unless it really had to be done. Secondly, following the thesis that only Nixon could go to China, the Liberals were trusted to cut spending with compassion in a way their Conservative opponents could never be trusted to do. The government drew heavily on its core party branding and reinforced the conclusions it led to, as this passage from the 1995 budget speech illustrates. This government came into office because it believes that the nation's priority must be jobs and growth. And it is because of that, not in spite of that, that we must act now to restore the nation's finances to health. Not to act now would be to put our fiscal house in, not to act now to put our fiscal house in order would be to abandon the purposes for which our party exists and this government stands: competence, compassion, reform, and hope. The debt and deficit are not inventions of ideology. They are facts of arithmetic. When finished, the government did not try to minimize or hide the spending cuts they had implemented, as both previous and subsequent governments have done. On the contrary, they celebrated the most dramatic reduction in the size of government in Canadian history. Quotes that illustrate that. By 1997, we will have reduced program spending from $120 billion to under $108 billion. Relative to the size of our economy, program spending will be lower in 1997 than at any time since 1951. The public service will be reduced by some 45,000 positions, of which 20,000 will be eliminated by the summer of next year. It's highly unusual for governments to be advertising those things. Normally, they try to do that by stealth or subterfuge, but people needed to know that big things were going on. The communications rationale was twofold. First, the accentuation of the cuts to federal program spending was essential to the fairness argument. Canadians would know that transfers for health care and education had been cut and that employment insurance had been tightened. So they needed to know that the federal government had scoured its own spending before those cuts were made. The government made sure that federal cuts before health and education was made clear from the start. Second, Canadians were cynical about the likely success of the deficit reduction initiative. And these kinds of tough measures in the politicians' backyard were critical to convincing people that this government meant business and was going to fix the problem. There was one conspicuous new tax in the budget of 1995. Not only did the budget have to be fair, it had to be seen and believed to be fair. In that vein, the budget had a blatantly populist measure, a temporary tax on the capital of large deposit-taking banks. It was in effect for a year and raised about $100 million. The sum of money was insignificant to the size of the deficit, but it was enough to anger the banks. That, in turn, helped other Canadians believe that the budget really was spreading around the pain to everyone. Once the government determined that cutting, this might be of particular interest to the provincial officials that are here, once the government determined that cutting the transfers to the provinces for health care was going to be part of the 1995 budget, it was inevitable that those cuts would be opposed and that there would be political damage. The government sought to minimize that damage. First, in order to mollify the provinces, the cuts were delayed for a year to give time for adjustment. And second, all federal transfers were combined into a fund with fewer restrictions and more flexibility in how provinces spent it. What that meant in reality is that they tried very hard to hold the line on health care spending, and they virtually eliminated welfare in most provinces. But that's a different story altogether. Publicly, the government relied on some key research-tested messages to justify the health care cuts. Cuts and transfers to the provinces were essential to eliminating the deficit. Translation, we had to for the economy to be strong again. Cuts and transfers were less than cuts to the federal government. Translation, we couldn't avoid it and we really tried. Provinces were cutting health care funding before any federal cuts took place. Translation, if you're unhappy with your health care, blame them, not us. Provinces have better balance sheets than the federal government. Translation, just because we cut them doesn't mean they have to cut health care. All of those arguments were modestly effective, but the health care transfer cuts were by far the least popular part of that budget, and shortly after the deficit was eliminated, pressure began immediately to restore them. Virtually immediately after the 1995 budget, public attitudes began to change in key ways. Confidence in the government's budget policy improved. Confidence in the government's management of the economy improved. Belief in future economic growth improved. All underpinned by an emerging and growing belief that the best route to a stronger economy and more jobs lay in eliminating the deficit. And ultimately, far from being the political death knell for the Liberals and Martin, as the pundits forecast, and as many in the Liberal caucus and cabinet feared, it led to long-term electoral success. This really is a great story about how, through concerted strategic communications and consultations carried on over a number of years, government was able to implement massive change with broad public consensus. It was so successful that the ecosystem of Canadian politics, media, commentators, political parties, assumed that balanced budgets were now a rule of Canadian politics. The Liberals now felt that it was such an integral part of their legacy that it was part of their DNA. They had to advocate for balanced budgets. The NDP, federally and provincially, adopted it as a baseline for their platforms, believing that they could not be taken seriously on the economy if they did not promise to maintain balanced budgets. However, the critical link between balanced budgets and economic growth was not being tended. Increasingly, communications about the need to balance the budget relied on philosophical points that it was the responsible thing to do, instead of being a strategic or important thing to do. Over time, the need for balanced budgets became more of a political rule and less of an economic rule. In fact, the political rule held in Canada long after the economic rationale had dissipated, if not disappeared. Economists increasingly argued that other issues, inadequate and crumbling infrastructure, weak consumer demand, growing income inequality, were of greater economic concern than balanced budgets. However, politics was not responding to these issues because of the constraint of the balanced budget rule. Unbeknownst to the political class, the public consensus they were obeying had begun to fray almost immediately upon the successful elimination of the deficit. Inside the government in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was often said that managing the politics of the budget surplus was more difficult than managing the politics of eliminating the deficit. And much of the challenge of managing that fell to Ralph Goodale, who was the Minister of Finance through that period. With the budget in balance and the economy strong and growing, the public demand was to repair the damage spending cuts had wrought on the fraying social safety net, especially health care. At the same time, Canadians had moved from thinking that tax cuts were unaffordable to demanding that a government now flush with cash return some of it to them. The public expectation of balanced budgets really began to unravel with the 2008-2009 economic collapse. First, people started to get the impression that perhaps the fiscal constraints on government were not as severe as government had led them to believe. This was particularly the case with the industrial bailouts in that period, like to the auto sector. People who had been used to hearing government say that it couldn't afford daycare, or it couldn't afford a better health care system, or it couldn't afford better infrastructure, suddenly saw how much money could be available if the right, i.e. powerful people, asked for it. That fundamentally changed people's relationship to this issue. Second, the downturn exacerbated some problems that had been developing for some time, principally growth in personal debt and lack of savings. In that time period, 60% of Canadians had more debt than savings, including their home mortgage and home equity, and most people thought that it would take more than 5 years to pay off the amount of personal debt that they had. They realized they had unsustainable levels of debt. Linked with this was a lack of preparedness for retirement. People started contemplating the fact that they were not going to be able to afford to retire anywhere near the age of 65. This focus on their personal and micro issues made the macro issue of the deficit significantly less important. Third, and most critically from this perspective, as the focus shifted again to the need to spur economic growth and opportunity for people, balancing the budget was not seen as central to that effort. Where in the 1990s, people had been convinced that the deficit represented a structural flaw in the economy and that we couldn't have a strong economy or create jobs if we didn't deal with it, by 2010, people saw the deficit as a symptom of our economic weakness, not a cause of our economic weakness, and just one of many symptoms of the economic weakness of the country, of which their own balance sheet was to them a more compelling piece of evidence than the government's balance sheet. Canadians felt that they were personally nowhere near where they had hoped to be financially in their lives. 60% of Canadians think that they are behind where they hope to be financially at this point in their life, felt little security for the future, who felt that the economy was permanently weaker than it had been, and that that negative trajectory would continue. When I would ask people whether when the recession was over and the economy normalized, would we have a stronger, better standard of living than we had before, or a weaker one? 60 to 70% of Canadians would say we are now in a zone where the economy is permanently ongoing weaker than it had been. And it's becoming a truism to say, but it's still remarkable to say, that this is the first time in Canadian history that people have felt that the next generation will have a worse quality of life than the current generation does. It's an inversion of the Canadian dream. The large majority of Canadians did not think that these problems would be solved without direct, strategic government intervention. For several years, the political system grappled with how to reconcile increasing demands for government activism on the one hand and the balanced budget rule on the other. Most constrained at the federal level were the opposition parties. They railed against the Harper government for failing to address the anxieties Canadians were feeling, but staying within the fiscal box of the rule, were unable to propose solutions grand enough to be meaningful. Something had to give, and in June 2014, it did. Thank you very much. That's hardly an applause line. As I read this, I realize there aren't any. Should have read it at least once before. Anyway, that's why I failed geology. The year prior, the Nova Scotia Liberals campaigned on investing in the economy and at the expense of balancing the budget, and won, defeated the existing government. Ironically, and foreshadowing the events even of this past weekend, it was an NDP government that was defending austerity in that election campaign. But the dam really burst in the Ontario provincial election. Liberal Premier Wynne proposed an aggressive role for government in the economy, most notably $30 billion in infrastructure spending, a new pension plan to augment the CPP, and a fund to attract business to establish in Ontario. The Conservatives countered that the province's deficit and debt were the fundamental issue and proposed to eliminate 100,000 positions in the Ontario government. In what was a clear-cut choice between austerity to get the government's books balanced and investment to kickstart and grow the economy, the balanced budget rule had no traction. A scandal-plagued 11-year-old government was re-elected with a majority. Conservative Party spokespeople openly acknowledged that the deficit had turned out to be a lot less important to people than they thought it would be when they were constructing their platform and campaign strategy. The federal election was the latest illustration of the sea change that caught Canadian politics flat-footed. It was no surprise that Prime Minister Harper would campaign on a balanced budget. He had moved heaven and earth to get to balance in the election year and saw it as the basis for re-election. What was a surprise was that for the first time in 2 decades, there was a debate about the merits of a balanced budget in the election campaign. Don't. The NDP assumed that the balanced budget rule was still in effect, especially for them. They committed themselves to balancing the budget in the first year of an NDP mandate and in every year after. But, as had been the case in previous elections, that left them little financial room to meaningfully distinguish their plan from the Conservative plan. As respected commentator Steve Paikin wrote, I asked Mulcair why he thought it was so imperative to be even a tougher deficit hawk than the Prime Minister. He said it was immoral to go further into debt today and pass on the responsibility of repaying those debts to our children and grandchildren. It did sound a tad odd to hear Mulcair and Thompson, and in this case he's referring to Andrew Thompson, the former Minister of Finance in Saskatchewan, uttering campaign lines that sounded very similar to ones used by Progressive Conservative Premier Mike Harris in the 1990s. However, Trudeau and the Liberals took a different tack midway through the campaign. Up to that point, Trudeau had proclaimed his own commitment to balance the budget. On August 28th, he ditched that commitment. In so doing, he had the fiscal room to propose a major infrastructure spend to boost economic activity and to pay for a major increase in transfers to the middle class. It caught everybody by surprise, and many thought it would be politically fatal. To quote Paikin again, quote, "When Finance Minister Joe Oliver presented a balanced budget for 2015-2016, it seemed to usher in a new era of back to the future. Once again, running deficits would be unacceptable, and any party that declined to promise to balance the books would be toast. That's why yesterday's announcement by Liberal leader Justin Trudeau appears to be such a breathtaking gamble," he wrote. The results speak for themselves. Trudeau, in third place when he said he would run deficits if elected, is the majority prime minister. Harper and Mulcair are out of politics. The key difference between the deficit debates in the 1990s and now is that in the 1990s, government and political parties actively worked to shape public opinion in support of balanced budgets, while in the current circumstances, political parties are reacting to public opinion. They have done nothing to create this opinion. It developed outside of the political system. The balanced budget rule of Canadian politics is dead, at least for now. It is a victim of neglect and changed circumstances. The neglect is that the political class came to believe that Canadians believed in the primacy of balanced budgets as a matter of philosophy and principle. They did not and never had. Canadians believed in balanced budgets as a means to an end, a stronger economy and more secure social programs. When the link between those things was broken, support for balanced budgets dissipated. Creating the connection required a concerted attempt at persuasion. It was never natural. It could never be assumed. It was always a case that had to be made. The changed circumstances are the combination of stagnant living standards and diminishing economic security for the middle class. Writing about the current American election, Elizabeth Drew stated, "The Trump and Sanders movements are both driven by a populist revolt against the assumptions of both parties' elites in recent decades that globalization and trade are good for our economy and that it is destabilizing for the country to run a budget deficit." I think the same is true here in Canada. All of those factors, globalization, trade, and balanced budgets, may be good economic policy. But if policy making does not account for and address the fact that those policies are also hurting and leaving behind a lot of people, and that the wealth those policies are creating is not being distributed fairly, then it will be increasingly difficult to build consensus around any set of growth policies. If public policymakers cannot or will not find a way to share prosperity more broadly, then citizens may have surprises in store for them that are much more dramatic than a budget deficit. Thank you to the Johnson-Shoyama School for having me. Thank you to the people that spoke before and said such nice things about me. I hope I lived up to part of that. Thanks for your time.